Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. Today's episode is one that I was very excited to do. We have two guests, Steve Gallo, who's the chief scientist at AIBS, and Matt Hayes, who's the director of Publons, which is housed within Clarivate Analytics. They joined me to discuss and compare two different publications on grant review and the sustainability of that system. One of the studies comes from AIBS and the other from Publons, and they bore a lot of similarities that made for interesting points of discussion. It was a really great conversation, and I think it gets to the heart of how good research is identified and funded, which really underlies the entire scientific enterprise and is one of the reasons that AIBS and Publons are discussing potential ways to collaborate in the future. But I'll let our guests describe. Matt and Steve, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I thought to get us started, it might be useful to set a baseline for our listeners, kind of on what grant review is and the role that it plays in the scientific process as we know it. How does this process typically work from, various funding agencies?
Well, here in the U.S., and Matt can tell us more about how they do it in the UK, but for groups like the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation, typically they'll receive proposals throughout the year. They're typically, for the National Institutes of Health, they'll have what they call a request for proposals. So there'll be a specific time frame that you'll have to submit a proposal, and have a deadline, and then you'll submit it, and then it'll be sent out, and scientists who have expertise in that particular research area will be recruited for typically a panel, which will meet in a face-to-face way, where they'll discuss the proposals that they're reviewing and kind of give them a ranking or a score. And after that, they'll use those kinds of rankings and scores to make the final funding decisions. So in NIH, it's like that. In NSF, National Science Foundation, it's slightly different in the sense that I think they, at least for some of the directorates, they allow proposals throughout the year, so there is no deadline necessarily. And some of those are reviewed on panels, and some of those are also reviewed sometimes through teleconference panels that don't meet face-to-face. And other times, even people just do what they call a mail review, where they'll review things over the internet and do it that way. So there's a wide variety of ways to procedurally do peer review, but in general, we're recruiting scientists to use their expertise to evaluate research proposals and kind of give them a ranking so that we can make a funding decision.
No, it's a great explanation. From my perspective, looking at the UK and other countries worldwide, there is one type of peer review to add to that definition, which would be where sometimes individual grant applications are reviewed by individual researchers. So some funders will commission researchers to review a specific grant application, and all of these different reviews are collected together and then reviewed collectively by a grant panel, so that the panel is able to review lots of grant applications in one go, all of which will have had some prior peer review from one or more individual researchers. So I would add that to the types of grant peer review as well. And I also just pull back as well and just highlight really how significant the grant peer review process is in terms of the overall research life cycle and the direction of research. We certainly, when we were looking at the extent of competitive grant funding and how that informs research, we found that over 60% of research outputs have some type of grant funding behind them. So you can see there that this initial stage, you might even call it the primary stage in the research life cycle, is incredibly important in terms of what direction ultimately research takes.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. It kind of speaks to the fact that this is the way that research tends to be funded.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say also, it's as Matt has noticed in his recent report, I mean, the rates by which people are actually getting funding are getting worse over time. So even though this is kind of the gold standard for something that you need to accomplish in your career in order to kind of be independent and maintain your own lab and move forward and all of these things, it's nevertheless the funding success rates are rather low and continuing to get lower. And I think right now, at least a year or two ago, for NIH, your average age to get your first R01 grant, which is a fairly standard science grant, is 41 or 42, I think. So for most scientific careers, people have to go through a lot of submissions of grant proposals before they actually get funding success.
So absolutely. We were in talking to funders for our report. We found success rates of 10, 20, even maybe 30% of the total grant application pool. But that's a very high rejection rate. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on the researchers that are seeking this funding. So you can see why, maybe we'll come to this in the course of the conversation, but you can see why there are calls for the peer review process to be reformed, or at least there's a thirst for a change of some kind. And there are lots of different potential models talked about, from a lottery process to maybe allocating funding to universities and then tasking universities with distributing it.
Yeah, I would say, I would even add to that the funding success rate, as it gets lower and lower, one of the things I think it does is puts more and more pressure on people to make decisions and discriminate between, maybe previously they were making decisions between, good and bad proposals, which might be a lot easier to do. It's much more difficult to separate between an outstanding and an excellent proposal, which I think many panels and panelists and reviewers are now forced to do. And that introduces, I think, or heightens the level of subjectivity in their decision making, which I think leads potentially to biases, which leads to the kinds of problems Matt was talking about and why people are exploring alternate methods for peer review and grant funding.
At one point I was curious about, who is doing this review? I think those of us who have worked in kind of a corporate setting will find the structure of this a little bit unusual. But these reviews are not being carried out by a dedicated team of people who do grant review all day, and that's their only source of income. That's their career. Who's doing this work?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it cuts to the heart of some of the issues with the current grant peer review process. So, in terms of who does the peer review, we found this is primarily academics or academic researchers, and they may be doing it for a fee, as you say, but in many cases they may be doing it for free as part of what they perceive to be their contribution to research. But if you look at how those reviewers or those prospective reviewers are identified, then you realize actually that what some of the challenges are of the system. We found that often those reviewers are identified by a panel or a board that has already been set up and has been in place for a number of years, or perhaps they will be taken from previously successful applicants at that funder, or they will simply be recommendations from one researcher to another. And I think you can see a potential danger there to the grant peer review process in terms of relying on quite a small reviewer pool, as it were, and also one that is mainly built around recommendations and interpersonal relationships and knowledge. And that can be problematic. And I think many grant applicants can have expressed some frustration that there's a sense in which it's the same people making these decisions, and therefore can be prone to bias and nepotism and so forth.
Yeah, now thanks for that, Matt. I would add to that, actually. I know in the National Institutes of Health, the scientists are recruited, I think, largely based on their expertise, but nevertheless, previous success with NIH funding, I think, is usually a requirement, or at least a highly, an important criteria in their recruitment. And so what happens is if there many reports have shown that there's kind of a funneling of grant funding to a small proportion of scientists have a disproportionate amount of funding relative to everyone. So those who don't have funding are also not allowed to be part of the decision-making process of what gets funded. So it's kind of a vicious circle. And also, in addition to that, this not only takes on a unevenness across the scientific landscape in terms of which reviewers are allowed to review, but also the funding success rates are different. For instance, there was a study in 2011 about how even different racial groups at NIH, different applicants who have different racial groups are funded at different success rates. And so that's a problem, because if you're funded at a lower success rate and being successfully funded by NIH is a requirement for being a reviewer, then that sets up an internal bias and a feedback loop that kind of continues that disproportionate level of funding. So there's some definitely recruitment is an issue that needs to be addressed. I think
I was just going to say that I think that point is really interesting, and I think if we talk about what other research could be done around the grant peer review process, one of the really interesting things would be if you could map reviewers and grant panels and look at the relationships between them in terms of citations, co-affiliations, etc., and look at that in the context of the global research network. And I think if you did that, and for example, if you looked at that at a national level within certain large governmental funders, I think that's where it would really highlight quite strikingly this loop that Steve outlined, where you have the same folk engaging quite regularly, and that can have an impact on bias. So I think that would be a really interesting piece of work.
No, you're right. And in fact, I think there was a group that did this in Harvard. I forget the name, but they looked at it in terms of relatedness of they looked at the references of the proposal itself and the applicant compared to the references of the reviewer, and they determined kind of a bibliometric, or looking at the similarity or overlap in their publications and their networks to see who knew who and who was related to who, at least in terms of scientifically, who publishes in the kind of the same area and is maybe co-published. And they found that people who are more related by their definition definitely tended to give proposals a better score. So there is some relationship there.
That's really interesting. I'd love to read that.
Yeah, it's it's problematic, but I think the issue also is that the other alternatives are also problematic.
Yes.
Okay, so you're describing a system in which there's some level of insularity within the reviewing community. It's hard to break into, and the entire system is being pressured by a greater number of proposals that we're seeing over time. And I just to touch on really quickly, are we seeing more proposals for a diminishing amount of funds, or is broadly speaking, are we seeing the same or increasing number of funds, but just a lot more proposals as people vie for that money?
For NIH, the proposals have been increasing, I know, but I mean, the budget has been increasing, but not enough at a rate that has, been keeping up with the success rate. So the success rate has been kind of going down, or at least been somewhat stable, I think. I don't know how it is in the UK, Matt, but no.
I would echo exactly that. We definitely know that the application rate is going up. Within our report, unfortunately, we didn't have access to those funding figures to look at those, and particularly taking out inflation and things like that. But I think if you were to look at it on a country by country basis, which is probably all you can do rather than generalizing globally. There are some significant challenges that certain countries face. For example, we talked to some funders that had big problems with deflation of their currency, and with the global research sector being so global and needing researchers from very many different countries and research centers, they were probably getting less for their local currency than they were previously. And so that was a significant challenge for them in terms of maintaining the funding they needed for all the applications they were receiving. So I think it is both the increase in applications and in some cases a decrease in funds, at least in terms of real-term funds.
Okay, that's interesting. And now I think it might be a good time to step back a little bit because we've already hinted at it somewhat. But can you each describe the surveys that were conducted and the reports that have resulted therefrom?
Okay, sure. Yeah. I think well, we both had a very similar idea to kind of look at the people who are participating in peer review as reviewers. I think in the literature in general, there's not a lot of, well, for starters, there's not a lot of data or literature or studies around peer review in general. And what does exist is mostly focused on journal peer review. So much less is on grant peer review. And what is focused on grant peer review in terms of studies understanding, how grant peer review works and whether it's finding the right proposals and all these kinds of things, largely focus on things like scoring, but very little of it focuses on the reviewers themselves. And one of the key parts to this whole process is, of course, the people who participate in the process. And so not a lot is known about specifically their demographics and what motivates them and how often, what's their level of burden in terms of peer review, how much do they participate in peer review throughout the year, what types of peer reviews do they participate in, and what do they think about them in terms of the quality. So those were some of the things that we were interested in assessing. And I think probably Matt had a very similar idea.
Absolutely right, yes. So as you mentioned, a lot of the research that's been done on peer review has been done on journal or article peer review. And in fact, we're one of those reports. So we did a report last year, the Publons Global State of Peer Review report, which looked at journal peer review. And it was really off the back of that we realized there was this demand for more research, particularly more insights on the research perspectives around grant peer review. And so we decided to do something about that using some of the data sets that we had available to us, as well as interviews. So the data behind our report is, firstly, we use data from our parent company, the Web of Science, which gives us data around the citation network and specifically the ability to track the acknowledged funding in terms of research outputs, in terms of publications, articles, and so forth that have acknowledged the receipt of grant funding, which is where I got that statistic that I mentioned earlier about 60% of global research output having some form of grant funding attached to it. So we used data from that. We also surveyed just under 5,000 users from our Publons peer review community. And all of those researchers had at some point or another either applied for a grant or reviewed a grant. We asked them a series of questions, and we also analyzed quite extensively their free-form comments, which I must say personally I found some of the most interesting, because that's where you got the really striking insights, both positive and negative, into the peer review process. And then we also interviewed funders because we wanted to get some more qualitative, anecdotal feedback across these different research centers, and we knew how different the practices were from one country to another. So just to give a couple of examples there, we interviewed the Swiss National Science Foundation, the Medical Research Council, and UKRI here in the UK. also the National Center of Science and Technology Evaluation, which is the governmental funder in Kazakhstan, and the European Research Council, as well as some American funders as well. So that gave us quite a broad range of experiences, and we pulled all that together to try and triangulate those different data sources and see what the key trends were.
That's great. I should mention too, I forgot that since you delved into the details a little bit, people are probably wondering, AIBS is a non-for-profit organization, but we've been providing scientific services for a variety of research funders for 50, 60 years, and so that's that's why we're interested in this in particular. Is not only as a scientific society, but also as a provider of scientific services, which include peer review. We've also been interested in what makes reviewers tick, and so we also sent out a survey very similarly to applicants and people who have reviewed for either us or other scientific organizations in stateside in the U.S., mostly biomedical for the most part. But so either they've been an applicant or a reviewer, and our study is a little smaller. It's more like 1,000 respondents, but the results are remarkably similar.
Indeed, yeah, that was particularly striking when we started comparing our results, and I think quite encouraging in a way. Yes. To know, because that's the other thing that we should mention in terms of one of the main differences of any study on grant peer review as opposed to journal peer review, which is the dearth of information at a global scale. So with journal peer review, we found when we did our report, we're quite lucky because there are a number of large editorial submission systems through which most journal peer review activity takes place.
That's right.
And if you're fortunate enough to be able to partner with one of those submission systems, as we were, you can get information at scale about what's going on. However, in the grant peer review world, generally speaking, there aren't those large service providers. You tend to have national funders that have their very specific system that they've developed in-house, and they also have their own very unique way of conducting the grant peer review process. So it is quite challenging to get those trends and insights at scale. So it's encouraging to see in our reports, but also in other reports that both of us were looking at in our literature review, that a lot of these trends are found elsewhere. So we know that these are significant issues, and they are common to most research centers globally.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting distinction between the between the journal side and the article side and the grant review side. I hadn't thought about the role of that. Submission systems like the one that BioScience uses, which is Scholar One, would have as sort of a data producing item as well, because it is extremely widely used. And if one were partnered, one would be able to pull all sorts of useful information for studying the peer review process, because it kind of keeps track of everything. But you don't have that sort of universality on the grant review side.
Yeah, I agree. That's different funders do have different processes, and you don't have access to their systems. And there's also another level of problem in terms of analyzing data related to grant funding, because there's confidentiality. These are in general, journals review scientific works that have already been completed. They may have been written up, and maybe they'll be tweaked after peer review, but the experiments have been done. With grant review, the experiments haven't even been done yet. So it's there's a bigger issue of confidentiality that a lot of grant funders obviously take very seriously, and so it's hard to gain access to that data as well. So that's another reason why these studies were important, is because not everyone has access to this yet. Everyone really needs to understand what the landscape looks like. And I would just add real quick, one of the key findings of both of our studies is, I think, that that not all reviewers participate in the same level. Some reviewers or some scientists participate in many more peer reviews than others, and that's actually a result that not only is similar between our two studies, but also is something that is echoed in previous studies on journal peer review as well. And so this is even though they're very different systems, there are some common trends.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that issue, actually, reviewer workload, because that seems to me a really good example of the differences in the data available and why it would be useful to be sharing more of this data, at least in terms of research purposes. As you mentioned, we both identified this issue where a very small number of reviewers worldwide are conducting the majority of the reviews. But one of the things that we were able to look at in journal peer review was we were able to see how that breaks down when you look at what we called the review submissions gap. So you could look, for example, at China, and you can say that China contributes X% of global article submissions, but only X% of global reviews.
Yeah.
And if we were able to have that kind of data, anonymized, of course, but at national level, we would then be able to also start seeing some of these flows in funding. And I'm sure it would also show you there some interesting national, but also institutional gaps, as it were, in terms of who's perhaps submitting the most applications versus who's contributing the most in terms of reviews. And that would potentially lead to some useful reforms about spreading that workload.
Absolutely. Actually, I can tell you, I think in terms of NIH, I know that they know that the funding is not uniform across all states, for instance, and I don't believe it's uniform across all institutions either. And they do have some programs specifically created to mitigate that. But if you look at the rosters, which are public, by the way, for NIH, you can see that they represent similar proportions of the states that get the most funding, and tend to be well represented on those panels. And so, I think there's definitely what you said is absolutely true.
And I think that brings us to kind of an interesting question, which is we have this system that's largely been uninterrogated, at least by scientific means over the years. But now we kind of have an idea from these two surveys of the sentiment that people feel toward it. And I'm kind of wondering, what did you find? How do people think of this system? Do they like it? Should it be overhauled? Would do funders and participants want to throw it out? What's the response been like?
I think that's probably for you, Matt.
Oh, that's very gracious of you. Well, so I would start by saying, by focusing on the positive at the outset, which is, so when we asked researchers, first of all, what they feel about the peer review process, and if they would agree with the statement that peer review is the best method we have for ensuring we fund the right research, when you ask that question, the vast majority of researchers agree that peer review is indeed the best method. So in our case, I believe the figure is 78% of researchers. So there's certainly a lot of support for peer review, and that peer review remains as relevant now as it ever was. And in fact, as I think we'll talk about, arguably even more so than it was in the past. However, when you break those responses down and you ask follow-up questions about particular aspects of the peer review process, such as how the peer review process treats junior researchers versus more senior researchers, whether or not it encourages innovative or risky research, and other measures, for example, diversity as well, that's where you see that the same researchers that feel that peer review is the best method that we have also draw attention to a number of issues with it. And those issues are the ones that I just outlined. So whether it funds innovative research, whether it's fair in terms of junior researchers. I thought that statistic that Steve mentioned earlier about the average age for the first grant application, the grant award being made, was fascinating. So we do know that there are issues, and we'll come on to this, I know, but there are some obvious areas where improvements can be made. And I think if we look at some of the, I wouldn't say extreme, but some of the radical and very different proposals that are around there at the moment for how we should evaluate grant applications, for example, lottery systems. One thing that was striking to me was funders and researchers talking about the role of peer review in terms of the accountability and transparency of the process. So whether or not it always funds the best research, it's certainly seen as a way of ensuring accountability and giving researchers the confidence that they will be evaluated by experts in their field. As soon as you start to bring in other measures that don't bring in experts and fellow researchers, I think that's where trust in the system starts to break down. And certainly we saw a number of complaints about national funding systems where it was perceived that politicians or civil servants were determining the flow of funding more than their fellow researchers. What are your thoughts, Steve? I think that would be a good introduction to this
yeah, no, I agree. That's, and I should say one thing is that even though some of these alternative systems are definitely possibilities, very few of them have actually been done in real life and tested to see whether they actually do, promote better science or less anti-innovation and or less conservative than peer review and have. So there's no guarantee that there will be any improvement there, although it's all exists in the theoretical right now. So that's one thing. But the second, I would say, in addition to all of that, in addition to reviewers feeling that this maybe is the best process, but there are some problems with it, I think another major concern is really the sustainability of it, and to make sure that if we do continue using this process, that that changes don't need to be made in the future to keep it running. And I guess that harkens back to what we were speaking about earlier, that we found, and I think you found something very similar, where a very small percentage of reviewers did a large, disproportionately large portion of the reviews that were seen in our relative surveys. And so, in fact, I think many times they measure inequality through something called a Palma ratio. And we found a ratio of something like, let's see, what was it? It was something along the lines of the top 10% reviewed 3 times the amount as the bottom 40% of respondents. So it's it's substantial, the differences between people reviewing the most and people reviewing the least. And so, is that sustainable? And when you ask, one of the things that we asked in our survey was, what's the absolute maximum you can put towards peer review? What would you say is the limit in terms of how many hours you have to actually spend? And the people that work the most, obviously, would make sense that they're at closest to the limit. And in some cases, it seems as close as 90%. So this is a problem in the sense that not only is peer review may be the best system, or it may not, but certainly either way, if we choose to use it, we definitely have to take into consideration where the workload is and where people may be hitting their limits.
Absolutely, I think that those figures are really interesting. We had similar figures, I suppose, from a slightly different way of looking at the numbers. For us, we found that 4% of reviewers contributed 25% of reviews.
Yeah,
and that was a very conservative assessment as well, using our 5,000 researchers. I'm sure that in reality, it's actually much worse than that. And I think that it was clear from some of the freeform comments from our researchers that there are very practical steps that funders can take to try and alleviate this. For example, we know that there are some funders already experimenting with the idea of an initial round of the application process where a researcher only needs to submit a very brief summary of their proposed research. And then that goes through a quality control phase. And if it's decided that, yes, the funder would be interested in seeing a more detailed proposal, then the researcher goes away and does that. And I think that would be useful to look at for other funders, because you can see there you're saving time not just from the reviewers, but also from the applicants themselves.
You're right.
It's worth pointing out that it's not just the reviewers that find, or at least those reviewers that are reviewing a lot, it's not just those guys that are finding they're spending a lot of time on this. Also, applicants are finding they're having to spend time, which if they ultimately feel the success rates are not reasonably achievable, they feel is wasted. So
no, that's true. I think the National Institute of Health Center for Scientific Review reviews 80,000 proposals a year or something like that. It's ridiculously high. And I would just interject real quick that as far as I understand it, one of the successful strategies I've heard to reduce proposal loads is the National Science Foundation has some of its directorates, I believe, where they don't have these RFPs, these requests for proposals that have specific deadlines. Because many times what happens is there'll be 2 or 3 deadlines per year, and as a researcher, you're trying to hit those deadlines to get a grant application to each one, because if only 20% are funded, then you've got to get 5 in per year in order to guarantee you get 1 funded, or at least up your chances of it. And so one of the things that they've done is they've removed the deadline, and they found that actually it results in a decrease in the number of proposals, and that people tend to then put their energy more towards something that they really think will win. And so they tend to get, I think, better proposals, at least anecdotally, that's what I've heard. And certainly the numbers of proposals per year have gone down. So that might be another potential strategy.
It sounds like there are some ideas on the table that may help to alleviate these problems and increase the sustainability. Are there any others? What role does transparency play in this process? I think we talked briefly about earlier that this is largely a very blinded and very private process, obviously for the purpose of keeping the research that has yet to be conducted from being overly revealed and potentially scooped. What are some other avenues that might be explored?
Matt, your study shows very convincingly that, I think we had both found that people are motivated largely to review as a service to the community, and not by being paid by honoraria and whatnot. But that as a service, they want to be recognized as such, as doing something, and have that count towards their building of their CV and their adding to their career trajectory. A lot of times, scientists are evaluated for tenure based on such things as a peer review service. And so actually one of the great things that Publons has done is created a venue where you can actually log in where you've participated in peer review. And so I think one of the things that Matt's study has shown is that people want to have a level of recognition. So I don't know if, Matt, you want to speak more to that, but I thought that was I was most impressed by that. That was a great result.
Well, thank you, Steve. You teed me up brilliantly there. You're absolutely right. I think that so we asked researchers what they thought would improve the grant peer review process, and 90% of respondents thought that greater recognition of their grant peer review work would improve the process. And there are many ways of breaking that down. But before I do that, it's worth also noting that when you ask researchers then to look at a list of areas that could be improved, and how they would rank those in terms of importance, cash comes quite low down. It comes 6 after other areas such as training and greater guidelines and this issue of recognition.
Same thing.
Absolutely. And then when you ask researchers a bit more about why that is, funders might be interested to know that many researchers feel that either they can't take the cash because they have a conflict, or maybe they don't want to get into the whole tax situation. Sometimes I've heard of funders from emerging research centers that are desperately trying to get reviewers outside of their country because they don't have the particular experts they need, and also where they do, there's a conflict of interest. And yet in doing so, they are offering cash, and it's being perceived by researchers on the other side of the world, in UK, Australia, wherever, as, oh, look, there's another dodgy email in my account. So they're not actually getting any response to those queries. So I think that cash is, first of all, it's not viable, we know, for many funders, but it's encouraging as well that it's not considered to be something that really motivates reviewers. What does motivate them is something that ultimately shows their contribution to the field and helps advance their career, and hopefully help advance future grant applications. And we know that many funders now ask applicants to include their review contributions in their proposals. And we also know that universities are starting to look at peer review as another measure alongside publications and citations. So I think there's definitely something there that a service provider like Publons can help with, but also that funders and universities can close the loop on. And I think that would help both bring more researchers to the peer review process and re-energize those reviewers that are already there and feeling undervalued.
Yeah.
Then the other aspects of the reforms that would help with the process, I think, James, you alighted on it when you talked about transparency. We know that a number of reviewers are frustrated that after they've reviewed an application, they don't hear any more after that as to whether it was funded, what the outputs were, why it may not have been funded, and so on. And there's a real hunger for being able to follow up on that. I mean, it's fairly common practice now that for a journal peer reviewer, you would be notified by the publisher that the article you reviewed has gone on to be published. And that's a great way for the publisher of re-engaging the reviewer, who is also a prospective author and reader of their content, with their work. So I think I can see a similar line being taken on grant applications and subsequent grant awards as really helping the funders build their community. And also I can see benefits there in terms of maintaining the trust and accountability of the peer review process. If there are ways of making it more transparent, whether that's publishing the reviewer identity, which may not be appropriate in certain contexts, or simply just publishing the reviewer report. I think experiments like that would help open up the process and help alleviate some of those concerns researchers have around the relative biases that we talked about at the outset.
I would also argue too, one of the things that we found in our survey was that career stage obviously was, a big predictor of review participation, and where mostly senior scientists were involved in peer review, and so junior scientists were less so. And yet, again, when they are involved, it's much more important for a junior scientist who may not have their own R01, who may, for this transparency, that it counts a lot more for them. And they're looking for, things to show that they've engaged in this system and, done their service. And like I say, it helps people with tenure and things like that. So it's important, I think, for early stage career scientists to have this venue for transparency, and not only for journal review, but one particular grant review, and it may showcase the inequities there with your data, actually, and that may be another study.
Absolutely right. I mean, I spoke to one grant panel member who had been a member of a number of UK funders and their grant boards, and she was talking to me of the benefits of bringing early career researchers actually into the room for those grant panel conversations, just so that they can get exposure to how the process works and what is considered important in an application, what success looks like, and so on. And I can certainly see that, there could be scope for sort of mentoring type program where a more senior researcher, perhaps a supervisor or department head, could nurture an early career researcher through a grant application review. And they would learn so much from reviewing a grant application in terms of how to successfully structure it and what the funder is looking for. So it would benefit both the researcher and ultimately the funder.
That's right. And just to add, I think, just to make it slightly more public, I mean, I think both Matt and I are interested in potentially having AIBS and Publons work together to help increase transparency with some of our peer reviews. We still haven't worked out all the mechanics yet, but there's a commitment, I think, on both parties to try and see this through, for what that's worth.
Absolutely, and I'm really interested in monitoring that as well as we experiment with it. I think certainly our engagement with researchers in terms of surveys like this is going to continue, and we think it'd be interesting to see, once you've offered a researcher recognition for their grant in some publicly available way, does that then lead to behavioral changes? Does that speed up the process? Does it bring in more quality? Does it have an impact when they subsequently apply for grants? So I think continuing to monitor this through data sets like this would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it sounds like there are some areas for future collaboration and fruitful areas for future research. Anyway, I think we've covered a lot of good ground today, so I would just like to thank both of you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, James. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you, James. Absolutely, it was a great opportunity. Thank you for having us both.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.